Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we're calling our work now through all of the different poems of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now on the poem Song of Myself to passage number 43. Now, we have already said that these final 10 sections are kind of like the crescendo of Song of Myself. Also, we should write down that this is the integralist pedagogy. It's a term that we used in our last lecture when we were talking about passage 42, right? Now, we're also going to come back in this section to passage 41. Now, just to remind, the pivotal line from Song of Myself comes from passage 4. Both in and out of the game and watching and wondering at it, I witness and wait. The fact that he uses that word witness will play again rather nicely into this background. Just to remind Whitman, his person, he was raised in a Quaker background, and Elias Hicks, that great reformer, that radical thinker, may be some of the seeds for some of the really more radical iconoclastic things that we're seeing here in Song of Myself. Now, my hope is that you've been with us at LearnStrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt. My hope is that you work through the 24 poems of inscriptions, the 19 sections from starting from Pomenat. Go back and look at what we said in passage 7 and in passage 10 about Whitman and religion and his desire to inaugurate a new religion. We're going to hear a whole lot more about that here. And then finally, in Song of Myself, I'm hoping that you watched our intro lecture as well as through passage 42. Now, because of the length of passage 43, I'm not going to be able to read the entire thing at first. Let's just go right to it. I do not despise you priests, all time the world over. 1855, all time the world over, was not a part of the set of lines. Can we just make an observation in 3A really quickly? Do you remember our study of the Odyssey? We've given guided lectures over every book. Do you remember book 22, starting at roughly line 340 or so? Leones, the priest, is brought in front of Odysseus, covered in blood and guts, you'll remember, and along with him a poet, and he asks the priest, "What are you?" And he says, "I'm a priest." And Odysseus just lops off his head, remember? And then the poet, he'll ask, "What do you do?" And the poet says, "I'm a poet, don't cut off my head." And Odysseus decides to save the poet, but he jacks the priest. Now, standing behind this set of lines is that recognition. What Whitman wants to say is, I'm not despiteful of you priests. So here we go. Whitman now talking about religion. I do not despise you priests all time the world over. My faith, look what he has to say about faith, is the greatest of faiths and the least of faiths. Now, this greatest and least will sound very much like Matthew chapter 20, as well as Matthew and the 25 in the account of the story of that we were referencing earlier, in as much as you did it to one of these, and the least you did it to me. My faith is the greatest of faiths, the least of faiths. Put it in your notes. Again, inclusivist in his thinking. It's such a big deal for Whitman. Enclosing worship, he said all worship in 55. Enclosing worship, ancient and modern, and all between ancient and modern. That word enclosing is the key word for this passage. In other words, I want to somehow subsume all of the different ways of thinking about religion, spirituality, and I want to subsume all of it. Notice he continues, believing, again, notice all these ing words, right? Believing I shall come again upon the earth after 5,000 years. Clearly a reference to the Luke 18:8 passage in question. When the Son of Man returns, shall he find faith on the earth? This thing that Whitman will do, where he identifies with Jesus Christ, we're going to get to it more in this poem. Believing I shall come again upon the earth after 5,000 years. Waiting responses from oracles. We're going all the way back, obviously, to Tiresias and to the Greeks. Honoring the gods. Saluting the sun. By the way, let's point out that this notion of worship for Whitman is all about reverence. It's all about honor. Yes? So here we'll honor the gods, saluting the sun, making a fetish of the first rock or stump, powwowing with sticks in the circle of Obus, the African sorcery, helping the Lama, properly it should be spelled L-A-M-A, right? Helping the Lama or Brahmin as he trims the lamps of the idols. Obviously we're talking here about the Tibetan practices. Dancing yet through the streets in a phallic procession. Obviously we're talking Dionysius festival here. Wrapped and austere in the woods of a gymnosophist. Now the Hindu sect of asceticism often unclothed or with very little clothing. We know about this through our study, of course, of Gautama Buddha. Drinking mead from the skull cap, we think about Beowulf. To Shasta's and Veda's admirant, of course, Hindu texts here reference minding the Quran. Back to section 41, Allah on a leaf. 2 times in those 2 different sections of 41, 43, we have reverence here given to the Prophet and to the Quran. Walking the Tikales, that is to say the Aztec temples, spotted with gore from the stone and knife. He's willing to admit that some really bad things happened in human sacrifice. Beating the serpent skin drum. And then from that, accepting the Gospels. So notice how he plays this interesting inclusive game, accepting him that was crucified, knowing assuredly that he is divine. Notice he goes from past tense, was crucified, to present tense, is divine. Now later, in Leaves of Grass, we're going to stumble across the poem, To Him That Was Crucified. And I'm going to fight the temptation to want to say more about this poem than I'll say when we get there. My spirit to yours, dear brother. Now I'm just reading the lines of this poem, To Him That Was Crucified, or a few of them. My spirit to yours, dear brother. Do not mind because many sounding your name do not understand you. I do not sound your name, but I understand you. He writes the poem specifically to Christ. I specify you with joy, O my comrade, to salute you and to salute those who are with you before in sins and those to come also, that we all labor together, transmitting the same charge and succession. We few equals, indifferent of lands, indifferent of times. We enclosers of all continents, all castes. When we hit this set of lines, we'll come back to passage 43 and we'll say, hey, do you remember so long ago when we were doing Song of Myself 43, we were playing the same game. To the Mass. It's interesting, the word Mass. Of course, it can mean collective. It can also mean the religious experience of Catholics. To the Mass, kneeling, or the Puritan's prayer, rising, or sitting patiently in a pew, ranting and frothing in my insane crisis, or waiting dead-like till my spirit arouses me. And we cannot read lines like this without thinking of Dante, the Pilgrim, and of course the Inferno. You'll remember he gets so tired he just sits down in passage Canto 24. We've given full lectures on it. And it takes Virgil to challenge him, up on your feet. This is no time to tire. Looking forth on pavement and land, or outside of pavement and land, belonging to the winders of the circuit of circuits. That is to say, the circuit riders, who the Methodists and others would take their journeys, and they would go from town to town, and they would do their sermonizing and the like. Whitman is going to identify with these sermonizers as well. One of that centripetal and centrifugal gang, and gang here, by the way, is not a negative term at all. I turn and talk like a man leaving charges before a journey, very much like the Matthew 25 verse. Notice his use here of the physics language as it relates to energy, that which is, of course, tending towards the center, and that which, of course, flies away from the center. He is the great inclusivist thinker. I am going to speak to everyone who is what? Well, look at the next lines. And this is amazing to me, the way the number of readers of Leaves of Grass will say, okay, I don't know for sure what I believe, but I do know this has happened in my life. Downhearted doubters, dull and excluded. It is true, of course, skeptics are often not included. Frivolous, sullen. He's going to twice use this next term. Moping. We've all kind of felt this, right? Angry, affected, disheartened, atheistical. It will be genius of Whitman that he will include the atheists along with the theists. I know every one of you. I know, by the way, just point out, the last word of this passage is known. I know the sea of torment. By the way, in 55 it was, I know the unspoken interrogatories. By experience, I know them. I know the sea of torment, doubt, despair, and unbelief. We're going to mention, of course, Goethe's Faust, 1790, an important text for Whitman. In other words, I know that feeling of not knowing, he says. And then, using interesting language from whaling, right? So they would go out with the whales, and they would throw those harpoons, and those harpoons had these little barbs on them called flukes. The whale's tail also, of course, was known as a fluke. It's interesting, that is to say, flukes can be used both as the thing that captures the whale and helps the whale to escape. I think Whitman's playing an interesting game here. How the flukes splash, how they contort rapid as lightning with spasms and spouts of blood. We can't read this without thinking, of course, of Melville and Moby Dick, right? He will say it this way in the 55 edition, but I know it is sure and alive and sufficient. I do not know. Notice he says, I take my place among you as much as among any, to be at peace, right? How the flukes splash, how they contort rapid as lightning, with spasms and spouts of blood. When you confront a theological question, it's like you're wounded. And then he says, be at peace. Using the language of the priest, right? Be at peace, bloody flukes. Again, the tail fin of a stricken whale, right? Of doubters and sullen mopers. We're back to the mopers again. I take my place among you as much as among any. In other words, I'm going to hang with the believers. I'm going to hang with the disbelievers and those who have been maybe wounded by their religions, is what Houston Smith once called those raised in religion. The past is the push of you. Me. All precisely the same. Back to this all omnes, of starting from Pomanar, passage 7. And what is yet untried, and afterward is for you, me, all precisely the same. In other words, we're all struggling. What is it that Plato says? Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting their own battle. We're all fighting battles. We're all doubting at times. We're all not sure. And he says, I do not know what is untried and afterward. In other words, there's a whole lot I don't know. But I know it will in its turn prove sufficient and cannot fail. In other words, here is Whitman's pedagogy and hope. We don't have to know everything to know this. There's always reason to hope. There's always belief that there's more coming for us. Each who passes is considered. Each who stops is considered. Not a single one can it fall. In other words, there is some way that we're going to all get through these tough challenges together. Reading Leaves of Grass will give the person who is doubting, the skeptic, a sense that it's okay. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Then he says it this way, and it's interesting that he uses the pronoun it, because the antecedent is not quite so clear. Maybe it's this answer of the wisdom that we all see. It cannot fall the young man who died and was buried. Again, I said this to you before. It's genius the way he goes from the general down to the specific. So we've been talking in kind of general ways. Now we're going to go to very specific images, and some of them are haunting. Look at this. The young man who died and was buried, nor the young woman who died and was put by his side. Maybe we would think a husband and wife, and maybe the time of plague or something, right? Nor the little child that peeped in at the door and then drew back and was never seen again. What a compelling image. So in the house, a man and a woman die, a mommy and a daddy, and the child will look in, see that they're dead, and then walk out of the house and no one ever sees the child again. Amazing. What an amazing image. Nor the old man, we think of Goethe's Faust for sure here, who has lived without purpose and feels it with bitterness worse than gall. In other words, come to the end of their life. You should put in your notes, Whitman is person, that this was probably his father that he's referencing here, or he's at least considering, right? Nor him in the poorhouse, the most socioeconomically disenfranchised. Nor him in the poorhouse, tubercled by rum and the bad disorder. By the way, Whitman was a big abstinence guy in terms of drink, and he wrote for the temperance movement. Nor the numberless slaughtered and wrecked after the Civil War. Obviously, we'll read these lines differently. Nor the brutish kubu, that is to say, from Palembang, eastern Sumatra, called the ordure of humanity. The ordure here actually means poop, the poop of humanity. In other words, the worst imagined people. The rumors had come back that there were these cannibal types that lived out in Indonesia and Sumatra. Nor the sacks, merely floating with open mouths for food to slip in. Nor anything in the earth or down in the oldest graves of the earth. Nor anything in the myriads of spheres, nor the myriads of myriads that inhabit them. Nor the present, nor the least wisp that is known. In other words, I include everything. And it is this inclusion for Whitman that gives him his sense of his faith. Faith for Whitman includes everything. The known, the unknown, the understandable, the not so understandable. Think of it in terms of what we've often said about moral development. That begins egocentric. It's right because I say so. But of course, we learn very quickly, no, you don't get to be a little Nazi. When you misbehave, you get jacked by the group, the tribe, the family. And we move from egocentrism to ethnocentrism. I believe it's right because my group, my tribe, my nation, whatever, will define it as true. But there is a third movement in moral development, and we will, of course, call this that world-centric, right? And we start to try to include as many different kinds of understandings of moral development as possible. This is pure Whitman, right? Let's finish quickly in annotating at 2a. Well, we all have to have faith in something. That's Whitman's view, right? And we might as well try to include as many faith perspectives as possible. That's the integral model. At 2b, again, those 12 nors, that anaphoria as we call it, it becomes almost like a mantra, doesn't it? At 3a, well, I mentioned Goethe's Faust of 1790 and that line, the eternal feminine leads us aloft. But how about Voltaire's Candide? Let's play that one out, 1759. We almost cultivate our own garden is the way in the end that one is understood. Finally, at 3b, do you think there is a difference between knowledge and wisdom? Or are they the same thing for you? And what about faith? If we have to believe in something, what is it that you believe that allows you to have a sense of hope in the world? And I'm hoping that your discussions with all of these poems from Leaves of Grass will help you as you develop your faith. Thank you.